place the recent confrontation between Israel and Hamas in the perspective of Israel's place in a very changing region. And then do a brief analysis of how the players have ended the conflict, the profit and loss account of both sides. And then perhaps say something about where do we go from here. So first, to speak about Israel's changing place in the region. The region, as we can see, in the last few years is changing at an unprecedented pace. And the kind of changes that we see in the region of the last few years, I don't think we have seen for the last 100 years. And what is emerging in the Middle East of recent years is indeed challenging in a way that has not been done before. The political order that the great powers of the time established in the Middle East at the end of the First World War, that is just over, or just exactly 100 years ago. So I come to Israel's place in the region and how the conflict with Hamas fits in with that. Israel's founding fathers had a perception of where the region was going, which proved to be basically wrong. And the assumption was that Israel had emerged victorious in 1948, that Israel was at that moment in time more powerful than the Arab states, but they were very concerned that this was not going to last. The Arab states were on the development curve. There were various military coups and revolutions taking place in the Arab world, and the Arab world seemed to be surging ahead in a rapid process towards modernity and modernization. And the Israelis feared that the gap, the military gap between Israel and the Arab states would gradually close and then open again in the Arabs' favor. That Israel would not be able to face the military potential of the Arabs. Bigger states, more populous states, more powerful, increasingly aligned with the Soviet Union, increasingly armed by the Soviet Union with the best of the best that one could obtain at that time. And the Israelis were seriously concerned that in the balance of power, the future for them was precarious. So one idea was to establish what Ben-Gurion called the Periphery Theory. Israel will make alliances with the non-Arab states of the periphery. Israel is at war with the Arab core. So it will make alliances with Iran, with Turkey, even with Ethiopia. It never really worked out. In fact, the best of all these three was the relationship with Iran, which was quite effective until the overthrow of the Shah. But the periphery theory never really took off. And Israel's problem wasn't really resolved, so Israel went nuclear. And Israel went nuclear in the late 1950s, early 1960s, because of this pessimistic vision of the future balance of power. Then came the war of 1967, the massive defeat of the Arabs by Israel, and the steady process of erosion and decline of the key Arab powers. The Arab states in recent years have not got stronger and stronger as the Israelis feared, but they have got weaker and weaker. The Arab Spring is a huge crisis of the Arabs. I don't want to go into all the reasons for the Arab Spring. Maybe I'll talk about it on some other occasion at the university. But the Arab Spring is a representation of the Arab world in crisis. the consequences of the Arab Spring, as we see them presently, an unprecedented challenge to the state order as created by the great powers in the aftermath of the First World War. States created in the 1920s seem to be falling apart. Syria, locked in a civil war, the end of which is unknown. Iraq, in a similar situation. Sectarian dissension, the rise of ISIS, the breakup of the Syrian-Iraqi border zone. What that holds in store, who knows? Libya is tearing itself asunder, as is Yemen. The weakening of the Arab state. But what the weakening of the Arab state means is that at the expense of the Arab state, which is weakening, the non-state actors in the region are growing in power and influence. ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, and there are many, many others. And like the war with Hezbollah, the struggle with Hamas is against a non-state player, which in a strange kind of way, much weaker than the Arab states of yesteryear, but much more difficult to defeat. Israel had a security doctrine for years, which was constructed to face the Arab states, and it worked. It was based on good intelligence, obtaining early warning of attack, preemption, to preempt attack, to carry the war to the enemy's territory. Israel was too small, it couldn't fight the war on its own. Rapid decision, and thus to create deterrence against the possibility of a future war. But that doesn't work anymore. There are no 6-day wars anymore. The war with Hamas lasted for 50 days, and it isn't over yet. I have my fears that in a few weeks' time we may be back at it. And I will refer to that later on. It's much harder to obtain a decisive victory. We don't have a clearly defined battlefield where you can obtain a decisive victory to defeat the Egyptian military in the Sinai Peninsula. It is much more difficult to obtain a decisive victory, albeit against a much weaker enemy. Hamas is no competitor in terms of, let's say, the military power of Egypt of the old days. And it has to do with the nature of this asymmetrical battlefield. Civilians and what the Israelis call humanitarian entrapment. That is, the army gets trapped into humanitarian problems that it cannot resolve. And you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. And if you retaliate, you will hurt civilians, and if you don't retaliate, you will suffer. This asymmetric warfare, the rocketry, for the first time, the Arab side has now succeeded in bringing the war to Israel's territory. Israel does take the war to the other side, to Hamas in Gaza and to Hezbollah in Lebanon, but they have succeeded in bringing the war to Israel's territory. And now Israel's home front is very much exposed in a way that the Israelis were not accustomed to. The home front in Israel was immune in previous wars. There is the psychological pressure and the anxiety of attrition, of protracted conflict. And there is no end in sight. But the Israelis have shown a considerable measure, I would say even surprisingly considerable measure, of social cohesion and solidarity in these crises. as opposed to the expectations very often that you hear on the Arab side, that Israel is, in Arabic they say, Qadiyya Mustana. Israel is an artificial creation. The Israelis come from somewhere else. They're not rooted in the land like we are. They will crack under pressure. And eventually they won't be able to face the music. There is a perception of time. In Hamas language it goes, Zawal Israel, Khatmiya Tarikhiyya. The disappearance of Israel is a determinant of history. It's bound to happen. So there is this expectation that the affluent Israeli society will not be able to face the constant agony of confrontation. But on the Israeli side, there is the similarly unrealistic expectation that under pressure Hamas will throw in the towel and lift the white flag. Well, they won't. And they don't have to either. They won't and they don't have to. Because on the Palestinian side, Hamas fighting Israel is truly popular, reflecting the popular will. The people really do identify with the muqawama, the resistance. And if you look at the polls that have been conducted in Palestine in the last few weeks by Khalil Shakaki, who will be here, as you've just heard, in a few weeks' time. At the moment, Hamas's numbers are higher than they've been for a very long time, maybe higher than ever. But these numbers may change. The talk of victory is not very lasting against the huge damage that has been caused to Gaza. So what did Hamas actually gain from the struggle? Aside from the fact that its popularity amongst Palestinians has spiked very impressively, Hamas still faces regional isolation. Most of the Arab states are on Israel's side when it comes to the Hamas issue. Maybe not openly, but certainly are not supporters of Hamas. There were more demonstrations on Hamas, in Hamas's favor, in Europe than there were in the Arab countries during the war. Hamas faces questions from the Palestinian public. That Palestinian public in Gaza that also desires normality. And the questions that Hamas faces from the Palestinian public in Gaza against the background of the damage and the suffering. What was gained after the first week of fighting when a ceasefire was offered and Hamas rejected it? Was the ceasefire that was obtained 6 weeks later any better than the ceasefire that was offered on the 15th of July? There was no real difference between the two. So what was gained by this continuation of the war? There are people who ask, and Hamas has to provide answers. There has been a severe degrading of the military capabilities of Hamas. The rockets were spent in large numbers, not very effectively because of the Iron Dome. Most of the offensive tunnels have been destroyed. More than 2,000 Palestinians have been killed. There may be as many as 100,000 who are homeless in Gaza. There are speculations that it will take anything between 5 to maybe even 10 years to rebuild what has been destroyed. And of the demands, the lifting of the border controls, expanding fishing rights, establishing a port and an airport, the release of prisoners by Israel, nothing of that has been obtained yet. There is a great deal of internal dissension within the Palestinian ranks now after the war. There is a certain tension between Hamas inside and Hamas outside. Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, the military and the political leadership outside the Gaza Strip, Khalid Mashal in Qatar. The decision to stop the fighting came from within. It was the insiders who wanted to stop the war. Khalid Mashal in Qatar was willing to press on. The internal struggle between Fatah and Hamas is escalating, not declining. There is a war of words, and the maintenance of the National Reconciliation Government is not clear. Both sides are detaining each other's activists. In the West Bank, Fatah detains Hamas people. In Gaza, Hamas detains Fatah people. Mahmoud Abbas accuses Khalid Mashal of planning a coup against him in the West Bank. If that's true or not, I have no idea. And Abbas is very outspoken, criticizing Hamas for what he says is an aimless and destructive war. There is talk that there are those in Hamas who are reassessing the war option, thinking again about the idea of war with Israel. War has its upside. It certainly brings pressure to bear on Israel. It brings huge international pressure to bear on Israel. Israel has its own losses, but Palestinian losses are Israel's political losses also. And Palestinian losses bring huge pressure to bear on Israel to desist. But it is obvious to Hamas that war and power and the use of force against Israel has its limitations. It has a serious downside too. What Hamas will come up with after this, who knows? But there is serious consideration of whether the war is an option to pursue further. It's certainly going on. There are those in Hamas who say that the struggle should be shifted to the West Bank. Gaza has suffered enough. And if Hamas wants to continue the struggle, it would be better if it was done from the West Bank. So maybe there will be an effort to move in that direction. So where do we go from here? The Israelis came up with a formula in the midst of the war, which they still pursue now: reconstruction for demilitarization. That Gaza should be rebuilt, that the people of Gaza should have a life, should have an economy, should have open borders. But Hamas must disarm. Is that doable? The answer, I would say, is no. Hamas will not disarm. They are a fighting organization. The fight with Israel is their raison d'etre. I think it would be virtually impossible for Hamas to acquiesce in their own disarmament. And they've said openly in the last few weeks that they will not acquiesce. So the question is not really reconstruction for demilitarization, but rather something more modest but going in the same direction, that is reconstruction of Gaza, that Israel should cooperate in the reconstruction of Gaza, allow for the reconstruction of Gaza. But at the same time, in cooperation with other players, seek to limit the rearmament of Hamas. That is, by supervising what goes in and out of Gaza, together with the Egyptians. Perhaps including the Palestinian Authority as a supervisor over the borders of Gaza. Although it will be difficult to see at the moment with the relations between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas being as poor as they are in recent weeks, how Hamas will agree to this kind of arrangement, or how the Palestinian Authority would really be able to impose its influence over Gaza. But there is a high level of cooperation through community of interest between Egypt and Israel. Both see Hamas as an enemy, and both cooperate against Hamas. Egypt at times sounds more hostile towards Hamas than Israel does. Can there be? There certainly should be, I would argue. Not sure that it's feasible. International supervision of Gaza. International supervision of the reconstruction and the non-rearmament of Hamas. That is, you get the European Union or someone like that to supervise the reconstruction, to see to it that the reconstruction materials that go into Gaza, the iron and the cement, go for the rebuilding of housing and not for the rebuilding of rocket launchers and offensive tunnels. Israel has an interest in Gaza's well-being. And there are Israelis now who I think are having second thoughts about Israeli policy over the last few years in constraining the economic well-being of Gaza. The notion that somehow through economic constraints Israel would be able to edge Hamas out of power in Gaza, I think was a very misguided policy. Certainly didn't bring about the desired result. And I think even contributed inadvertently to Hamas's choice to use force. So Israel, in keeping the peace and in the desire to keep the peace, has an interest in investing and in preserving Gaza's well-being. But in order to do so, there has to be a negotiation. There has to be a negotiation between Israel and Hamas, probably not directly, indirectly, to talk about the new arrangements, the border arrangements, fishing rights, a port, an airport, the demands that Hamas has made. My fear is that these negotiations are going to encounter serious difficulties. Hamas will ask for a lot because they have to justify the loss to the people. Palestinians in Gaza have paid a very high price. And they want to know exactly what they're going to get for it. And Hamas must bring something of great importance, of value. But it will be very difficult to get that unless they disarm or agree to disarm. Israel will be most reluctant to agree to the establishment of a port and an airport in Gaza if this is going to become the avenue for Iranian re-equipping of Hamas. I mean, the Israelis won't do that. It would be good for Gaza and the West Bank to have a close connection. Good for both. Certainly good for the Gaza economy. And just good for the people of Gaza to go to the West Bank. For people from the West Bank to go to Gaza. But if there is no understanding with Hamas on disarming, and if Hamas is thinking of transferring the battle to the West Bank, Israel is not going to allow a free connection between Gaza and the West Bank. And if the negotiations are going to encounter these kinds of difficulties, which I fear they will, the shooting will start again. 1967 is not the most important of them. 1948 is. There are the 1967 questions and the 1948 questions. The 1967 questions are those that deal with the border between the West Bank and Israel, how Jerusalem will be divided, issues that relate to Israel's size, but not to its very being. Then you have the 1948 questions. Those that do not result from Israel's expansion in 1967, but from Israel's creation in 1948. And this is where the difficulties arise. The real difficulties, the insurmountable difficulties at present. And the key insurmountable difficulty is the 1948 question of the Palestinian refugees. The right of return. Hakalona. Do the Palestinian refugees return to the state of Palestine? Or do they return to Israel from whence their ancestors came? Israel is willing to agree to the return of refugees to the state of Palestine, but not to the state of Israel. So you have the two-state idea. Both sides accept the two-state idea. But they have different understandings of what the two-state solution is. And I call this the intrusive two-state perception. The Palestinians have a perception of two states, which isn't really restricted to the state of Palestine next to Israel. The Palestinians have a demand of Israel that intrudes into Israel. The refugee return to Israel proper. So it's not just the state of Palestine next door to Israel, but the undermining of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, so the Israelis would see it from refugee return. Then the Israelis have their security requirements, which intrude into the Palestinian state. The Israelis argue that they must have some presence in the Palestinian state for security reasons, along the Jordan Valley in particular. They must control the airspace of the state of Palestine because of Israel's very small size. The Palestinians call this Israelis, this is Israel's occupation mentality. Akaliyat al-ihtilal. You people can't get the occupation out of your minds. You want out, but you want to stay in also. So both sides have the idea of two states, the two-state solution, both accept it. But the Israelis see their presence in the Palestinian state, and the Palestinians see their presence in the Israeli state. They have what I call these intrusive perceptions of the two-state idea, which are incongruent. So there is no clear avenue to conflict resolution. But I would argue that that is not where Israel should stop. There are those in Israel who would argue that since there is no avenue to conflict resolution, Israel must manage the conflict. I agree with that. But they argue that managing the conflict means maintaining the status quo, which I argue is untenable. Israel has two options. There is the Gaza model, and there's the West Bank model. The Gaza model, Israel withdrew from Gaza. Didn't bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians, didn't bring peace between Israel and Hamas. But Israel withdrew from Gaza. And it manages the conflict with Gaza from without, not by occupation, from without. Many people in Israel criticized the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. Big mistake, they said. We withdrew from Gaza, and what did we get for it? Nothing. Just the rockets. But Israel has had 3 opportunities to reoccupy Gaza. It hasn't done it. Didn't do it now either. And doesn't have the slightest intention. So the Gaza model is the recognition that there is a problem between Israel and Hamas. There's a problem between Israel and Gaza. But it should not be managed by occupation. On the contrary, by withdrawal and managing the conflict from without. The West Bank model is the opposite. The conflict should be managed by occupation and continue the occupation. And the argument is being made now with even greater force that the occupation must be maintained because look what will happen if. And look at Gaza. But here there is a real dilemma. There can be no long-term cessation of hostilities if the occupation continues. So there must be, I would argue, a middle of the road, whereby Israel does withdraw with an agreement with the Palestinians, or even unilaterally, towards the ending of the occupation. Better in an agreement rather than not. It cannot be sustained cessation of hostilities, sustained non-belligerence, if the occupation continues. There is another issue that Israel should think of: the shifting regional alliances. The Arab world is not what it was. Israel has allies in the Arab world. Real allies. Who have a lot in common with Israel on a variety of different issues. On Hamas, on ISIS, on Iran. But Israel cannot make the most of these regional alliances and shifts as long as the occupation continues also. And not least of all, and certainly from the Israeli Jewish point of view, Israel will find it increasingly difficult to maintain itself as the two things it sought to be from the very beginning. If the occupation continues and Israel is in control of 2.5 or more million Palestinians in the West Bank, Israel as a legitimate member of the family of nations, and Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, is endangering itself seriously. So what I'm saying is that even though conflict resolution is not at hand, Israel must seek a rational form of managing the conflict, which is not via the continuation of the occupation. That will not bring Israel any closer to a secure, non-belligerent existence with the immediate neighborhood. There are great risks involved here. And clearly, Israel cannot just walk out of the West Bank and allow for a Hamas takeover. If elections were to be held in the West Bank now, with Hamas riding high after the war, they would sweep the floor with Mahmoud Abbas. Probably the main reason why Mahmoud Abbas remains in power in the West Bank is because Israel is there to prevent Hamas from taking over. But a lot depends on the way Israel irons out its relationship with Hamas around Gaza. And I would say some open-minded thinking about the future. Not a starry-eyed view of peace in our time around the corner, it is not. But there is a middle of the road that we haven't seriously pursued. And that is the rational management of the conflict, not by the end of conflict, but by some form of ending the occupation in a way that would allow for continued non-belligerency.